Good morning. Once again, I'm Dr. Sandra Barnes, Vice President of the Colin Natchez campus. I would like to thank you all again for participating on yesterday and for joining us for our second day of the Natchez Literary Cinema Celebration's first virtual conference. I encourage you all to ask questions anytime during the presentation by using the comments section. We will monitor and address your questions at the end of the presentation. I now have the honor of introducing author, writer, essayist, W. Ralph Eubanks. W. Ralph Eubanks is the author of A Place Like Mississippi, which will be released March the 16th by Timber Press. Eubanks is the author of two other books, Ever is a Long Time, A Journey into Mississippi's Dark Past by Basic Books, and The House at the End of the Road, the story of three generations of interracial family in the American South by HarperCollins. Washington Post book critic Jonathan Hartley named Ever is a Long Time as one of the best nonfiction books in 2003. Eubanks has contributed articles to the Washington Post Outlook and Style sections, Wired, the Hedgehog Review, the Wall Street Journal, the American Scholar, the New Yorker, and the National Public Radio. A graduate of the University of Mississippi with a BA and the University of Michigan with an MA in English Language and Literature, he is recipient of a 2000 Guggenheim Fellowship from John Simon Guggenheim Foundation and has been a fellow at the New American Foundation. Ralph lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife and three children. From 1995 to 2013, he was Director of Publishing for the Library of Congress and is the former editor of the Virginia Quarterly Review at the University of Virginia. Currently, he is a visiting professor of English and Southern Studies at the University of Mississippi. Welcome, Dr. Eubanks.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So good morning, everyone, and happy to be with all of you today. Wish this were all taking place in Natchez rather than virtually. I'm going to talk about places in archive, but where I thought I would start this morning is with a quote from one of my favorite writers, Henry James, who wrote that it takes a great deal of history to produce a little literature. And I think that has been my experience as a writer who uses a lot of historical resources, that it takes a great deal of that to really try to find what it is that you want to write about. Although it might seem a bit untraditional, my years as an editor were probably the most important part of my path toward becoming a writer. And I think while some who wield a red pen feel that an editor should never have writerly ambitions, perhaps it is where I worked as an editor that had the greatest influence. For nearly 20 years, as Mrs. Barnes noted in the introduction, I was an editor in the world's largest library and archive, the Library of Congress. At the Library of Congress, it was my job to develop books based on the collections of the library, which meant I spent a great deal of time with my staff in archives looking for stories to piece together to develop books. The stories the collections could tell were really, truly endless, whether it was the work of the Farm Security Administration photographers during the Great Depression, or the story behind W.E.B. Du Bois's collection of photographs for the American Negro exhibit, the 1900 Paris Exposition, which I mention today because today is the birthday of Du Bois. Another great collection there that I also did a lot of work in was the work of designers Charles and Ray Eames. It was while I was working at the Library of Congress that I learned how the historical and lived experience intersect. Looking through old diaries, photographs, or reading oral histories taught me that personal history cannot be extricated from public history because individual lives are shaped by their times. One of the first archives that I remember throwing myself headfirst in personally was in the slave narratives collected by the Federal Writers Project. This was both a written and an audio archive. So there were actual voices I sat listening to on aging reel-to-reel tapes. The book that came from that, Remembering Slavery, included some of those recordings. And now, nearly 20 years later, that book remains in print because of the groundbreaking nature that revealing those voices had and continues to have in our culture, trying to learn about our past. So for me, in my time working at the library, archives moved from being a resolutely quiet and stuffy place for futzy scholars to one that brought the past alive when you thought about how an historical item had a connection to the present. My great challenge as an editor was to make these seemingly forgotten items from the collections feel contemporary rather than something dusty and old. And that was not always easy. But I soon got the hang of guiding historians and curators toward telling stories based in the collections that were rooted in something beyond the unique historical significance or provenance of a particular item. So when I decided to move toward writing, it made sense that my work as a writer would begin in archives, and that I would begin to apply to my writing what I learned as an editor. Now, as a writer, my writing blends elements of memoir, social history on the American South, particularly my home state of Mississippi. You know, as most of you know, Mississippians have always lived in a self-contained world, and that's reflected, I believe, in the way its people frame and tell stories. In my work, I strive to find this very fine line between regional myth and reality. And archival research, I've found, helps me open up the difference between the stories people tell in order to live in the South and the realities held within or hidden inside those stories. This means the narratives I create involve bringing the past into the present, as well as moving a story from the personal to the universal. Since I do focus on memoir, I've also realized that memory is a tricky thing, and I don't trust my memory. Archival material written on yellowing paper inside dusty archive boxes are, I've found over the years, my best friends. Letters, memos, and old newspaper stories serve as windows into the past and help me take readers to places and events that exist perhaps only in the fog of memory, or to details about the past that I encountered while collecting an oral history or listening to one in an archive. Archival research lets me know that I can present the stories I collect with confidence. So what I've learned over the years is that archives can help us make and create narrative connections. But it was while working on my current book, A Place Like Mississippi, that I began to think of place as an archive. And in this case, the place as an archive was the landscape of Mississippi itself, rather than a room in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, where I have done a great deal of my work. So this took me beyond print records and ephemera I might find in archive boxes and onto the roads of Mississippi to engage with the cultural memory the state's writers have layered over the state's landscape. If one begins to think about Mississippi as a place, as well as its geography and the provenance of those places, it becomes an actual source rather than simply a narrative setting. Once I learned to use place as an archival source, I came to realize that while researching place or places, the insights that you make while you're working and the observations that you write down, you're creating your own archive. What you see becomes layered over what others have seen imprinted on the same landscape. And in this case, it's what writers have seen imprinted on certain aspects of the landscape. For example, visiting the banks of the Chunky River and the town of Meridian helped me understand Brad Watson's The Heaven of Mercury in ways that reading various drafts of his manuscript would not. Going to those places, I began to see them and the spaces, the very spaces his characters inhabited, as well as how the place Watson created in his fictional world aligned with real places and their geography. Also, standing inside Eudora Welty's bedroom, I could imagine her hearing piano playing from Belhaven College, creating a sound she once described as the recurring dreams of youth, inescapable, never to be renounced, only naming themselves over and over again. Those recurring dreams of youth that she heard on Pinehurst Street were poured into her character, Virgie Rainey, in the story Spring Recital, and then transported to her imaginary setting of Morgana. In fact, I owe the entire narrative structure of a place like Mississippi to both a specific place and a poem about that place. So I'm going to share with you a few images from the book, and you can see what I'm actually talking about when I'm referring to place as an archive. Now, traditionally, the story of Mississippi literature begins in the Delta. That is the traditional way that scholars have approached this. I decided with this book to break with tradition. And I began the story in a place most Mississippians view as the end of the state, the Gulf Coast. Mississippi Highway 49 runs across the expanse of the Delta, along the edge of hill country, directly through the piney woods, and ends at a pier in the coastal town of Gulfport. Yet the highway's terminus at the Gulf of Mexico actually marks the beginning of Mississippi, I believe, rather than the end. Of course, the main reason many of us think of the coast as the end of the state is because it is also a place associated with the names of two powerful storms that felt like an ending, Camille and Katrina. In the popular imagination, the Mississippi Delta looms larger than life, since it also hugs the shores of the state's mighty river and inspired the musical art form known as the blues. But it is because of those life-altering storms on the Gulf Coast that we see how Mississippi can be remade, reshaped, and transformed. Natasha Trethewey's theories of time and space helped me realize that I needed to begin the story of Mississippi's literary landscape on the Gulf Coast. Here are the words in Trethewey's poem that were my source of inspiration, and this is the very spot where that inspiration began. You can get there from here, though there's no going home. Everywhere you go will be somewhere you've never been. Try this. Head south on Mississippi 49, one by one mile markers ticking off another minute of your life. Follow this to its natural conclusion. Dead end at the coast, the pier at Gulfport, where riggings of shrimp boats are loose stitches in a sky threatening rain. So this is an example of how I use place as an archive. And this is the spot that I began on in the coast, went to on the coast when I began the book, with the inspiration for narrative structure coming through the drive I took through the state. Whether it was through Natchez, and here is the river at Natchez, and Vicksburg, through the piney woods. And this is one of my favorite fields in the piney woods near where I grew up in Mount Olive. Or Jackson. And then on to the eastern hills and hill country, and finally the Delta. Going through all of these places, theories of time and space was playing through my head as I made that trip. And I feel I owe a great deal to that poem for letting me know that there was a specific place I should travel to and write about. For a book about Mississippi writers and their relationship to landscape, I learned that I needed to follow the instincts of individual writers about the very places that shaped them and shaped their writing. That meant traveling to those places and spaces to see how the real and the imagined sometimes blend together. These places became my archival sources. Now, both Natasha Trethewey and Jesmyn Ward have used the landscape of the Gulf Coast as a literary canvas. As I travel north from the coast toward my native piney woods, I realized that the story that could be excavated from that place was entirely different. If the Delta is the most documented region of Mississippi, I would argue that the piney woods is the least documented. And what exists archivally focuses almost exclusively on the history of logging, which I alluded to in an earlier photograph. But instead of looking at documentary photography in an archive, what I decided to do was to create my own photographs of the piney woods. I don't think of myself as a photographer, but I felt that for this book, I had to lean into my photographic skills to document a place that I knew very well because it's the very place that shaped me as a writer. So on a trip north from the coastal lands of Mississippi with its beaches and its Creole-influenced culture, the landscape and the sensibility of the state begins to change. It's something that writer Michael Farris Smith, characters in his novel Desperation Road, notice as they trudge along Interstate 55 toward the South Mississippi town of Macomb. And what they notice is that even in the dead of winter, South Mississippi awakes with a hint of green. And this photograph was taken in February, about the same time as we are talking right now. As Smith writes, in the southern Mississippi swamp, you can watch the world awaken as the pale yellow sun edges itself between the trees and moss and wide-winged cranes. Anne Moody's impressions of the piney woods in Coming of Age in Mississippi are in some ways parallel to those of Smith's fictional characters. Moody describes a swampy area with trees near her shack, with trees so thick that even during the day, the swamp was dark and mysterious looking. After driving through gravel roads that meet the highway, now named in Moody's honor, it didn't take me long to find a swampy area thick with trees that mirrored that description. And this is the pond that Moody describes in Coming of Age of Mississippi, where her family went and got the water that they used for their shack. And it was really following through her book, going down those roads, that I actually began to find these places and these settings that mirrored exactly the description that Anne Moody wrote about. And surprisingly, 60 years later, the landscape looks very much the same. The only thing that's not there is the shack where Moody once lived. So when I arrived at this spot that you see here, it felt like a prized archival find of a once undiscovered letter. And this was a feeling that I had over and over again as I visited the places I write about in a place like Mississippi. To find the world Willie Morris knew, I entered the gates of Glenwood Cemetery, where he's buried. It is there that you can find the witch's grave that he mentions in Good Old Boy, and that you can see where he played taps as soldiers were buried during the Korean War. It is in Glenwood Cemetery, near Willie's grave, in the silence that envelops that very spot, that you can also hear Morris's alter ego Swayze in his novel Tap sing, "An echo, I would learn, was a kind of life in perpetuity, remote and immune, distant lingering notes from afar, sweetly voyeuristic, while the grave was, after all, the grave." The most surprising discovery I made using place as an archive was a personal one. In the spring of 2019, I decided to visit what was once called Guine Street, which is now Margaret Walker Alexander Drive. And I went there specifically to visit the Medgar Evers house and to understand the neighborhood that shaped writers Angie Thomas and Kiese Lehman, as well as Margaret Walker herself. Walker had written 2 poems about Evers, and her friend Eudora Welty had written the short story, Where's the Voice Coming From?, which focuses on the night of Medgar Evers' murder. That spring afternoon, I had not anticipated confronting my own memories of playing in the same neighborhood, blissfully unaware of what had happened across the street. That day, I realized as a boy, I played in a house directly across the street from the Medgar Evers house, but never realized the connection between those 2 places. Silence about the violent past on Guine Street served as a means of not instilling fear in the children who grew up in the neighborhood, or for those who visited there, like me. But that same silence also served as a means of masking the truth of what happened there. That afternoon, when I visited the Medgar Evers house, a house that, as you can see from this photograph, Evers directed to have built without a front door, specifically for his family's safety. You had to enter through the door that you see there under the carport. I'd expected to encounter the world of Medgar Evers, Margaret Walker, Angie Thomas, and Kiese Lehman, but instead collided with my own past and realized how sometimes our own past can be caught between memory and forgetting. But that is what Mississippi is like. And the silences we create under what Kiese Lehman would call central Mississippi skies, we also find how we are connected. Angie Thomas and Kiese Lehman are writers who look at the world with a connection to a past we all share, though from a perspective that is free from the historical burdens that my generation really clasped tightly to about the civil rights era. Through using place as an archive, I uncovered a connection between Angie Thomas, Kiese Lehman, and I that I would not have discovered through a less intimate approach. Each time I enter an archive, I can't wait to get to the boxes and to start to read through the folders and see what I find. Working in archives stirs up a feeling of mystery inside me. since I never quite know what I am going to stumble over in a folder. But thinking about Mississippi Place as an archive now stirs up the same sense of discovery and anticipation. Every writer's life needs a little mystery. And I feel incredibly lucky to have encountered a few visual puzzles and even solved a few puzzles along the way as I sought to excavate the stories I told in a place like Mississippi. I want to thank you all very much for inviting me here today and for the opportunity to talk about a place like Mississippi and about the process of the work on the book. And I welcome your questions and look forward to answering them.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Eubanks. What a wonderful presentation. Love those vivid photos of our Mississippi. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Yes, I don't see any questions right now, but I did have a couple that I was curious about. Is there a story that you want to tell, but you still haven't got an opportunity to do so?
There's always a story in Mississippi. That's the thing, is that that you never know exactly what you're going to stumble across. One story that I have been working on, that I have written about for the Oxford American, is about the Delta, I guess really town of Mileston. And it's where my parents moved. My father moved there in 1949. And I've been looking at that place and what it says about the contemporary Delta. You know, Mileston was, it was part of the Farm Security Administration resettlement community. It was the only Black resettlement community in Mississippi during the Great Depression. And my father arrived at the tail end of that. And I've been trying to piece together the story of Mileston, and with that, tell a larger story about the Delta. Because the Delta is a place my father never wanted to leave, which I have just begun to understand now. So,
great, thank you. We do have one question. Why has the Mississippi landscape spawned so many notable authors?
That's a really good question. I think it's the reasons that I alluded to in my talk is there's so much that we are silent about in Mississippi. So many stories that we don't tell, or we keep to ourselves, and we don't learn about until we ask about them. And as I tell people, say, well, how do you find a good Mississippi story? I always say, probe the silences. And that's what I find that I do in my work a great deal, is I'm looking at the things that people are silent about and trying to pull those stories out of people, places, archives, and also to begin to enlarge the stories that we tell about certain things as well. I'm involved with a project right now at the University of Mississippi. We had a protest that African-American students participated in 51 years ago. I think it's 51 years ago today. And 89 students were arrested, 8 were suspended. We've been collecting their oral histories, and it was at an Up With People concert. So now that we've collected a lot of the oral histories from those who were arrested and participated in the protest, we're finding people in the community and how did they remember it? And also examining ways that the people who were part of Up With People remember that evening themselves. So always trying to enlarge the story, enlarge the archive, so that we're filling in some of the silences.
Another question, is it possible to describe Mississippi a sense of place? What is it exactly?
That's a very difficult thing to describe. I think I can talk about the origins of what I think our sense of place is. I think our origin comes from the fact that most of us who grew up in Mississippi is a rural place for the most part, have some connection with the land. Even if you live in one of Mississippi's smaller cities, everyone has relatives who still live in a rural landscape. So we have this connection to place that I think that a lot of states people don't necessarily have. That is part of what I think is the origin of our sense of place in the state. I no longer own the land that I grew up on. My family no longer owns that land, but I still feel connected to it. And I think that's a very typical feeling of people. That sense of a home place is a big part of the way that I think that creates that sense of place in Mississippi.
Okay, thank you. One more question. Could you talk about your documentary process in making pictures in piney woods? How did you decide to document those places?
Well, first I began with Anne Moody and Michael Farrar-Smith's Desperation Road, kind of imagining those places. And as I said, I took my copy of Coming of Age in Mississippi, went to those very places that she wrote about, trying to, basically searching for Anne Moody. Then I went through my native Covington County. One of the things that I noticed there is there's a lot of change on the landscape that's happening. There's a lot of, logging is coming in again. The farm that I grew up on is now planted in pines and was being harvested. There's a lot of land that I'm seeing is being bought by large concerns there, not necessarily the small farmers that I remembered. So I went and actually interviewed some friends in Mount Olive, people who'd lived there for generations, asking what had they seen in that landscape, making sure that the way that I was looking at the landscape wasn't through a lens of nostalgia, but was through what actually was happening there. And then going back to those places and beginning to photograph some of them. And finding the places that I thought would explain to a reader what this region of the state was really like. Because there's a description of the piney woods in the old WPA guide that basically says it is a non-place. And I was saying, I can't really have come from a non-place. I came from a real place. And I wanted to show readers that it's a real place with a beautiful landscape. That's very different, as Noel Polk says, it's a place outside the Southern myth. And I was trying to, so that was the other thing that I was trying to capture, that sense of that it's not outside of the Southern myth that you find in Natchez, that you find in Jackson, that you find in Oxford. We're this little, I guess it's a region that's really settled largely post-Civil War. And that still exists on the landscape. You still find signs of it.
Thank you. I have one more question.
Okay.
What was the most challenging thing that you faced as an author?
The most challenging thing? It seems like every book is a challenge. I'll just put it that way. So the greatest challenge, I think, is realizing that you have an idea for a book and you have to be able to let that idea grow and evolve. Nonfiction writers, we write from proposals for books. We don't necessarily, like novelists, we'll finish a manuscript and that's kind of our vision. We kind of create that vision. And when I teach nonfiction writing, very often writing a book proposal is part of that. I'm often doing this with fiction writers who have a very difficult time grasping that. And I say, a book proposal is a complete work of fiction. And you come up with this idea for a book, but along the way, there are all these surprises that come up. And those are the greatest challenges that, well, I had this idea of what it was that I was doing, but it completely changes. Or, you know, like that, what happened to me at the Medgar Evers house, that was a point in my narrative where I was trying to keep myself out of the narrative and to focus on those other writers. And I found that I was part of that story. So I think that's probably the greatest challenge for me sometimes, is seeing where do you insert yourself into the story and where do you keep yourself out and let the other part of the story really shine through. That can be the tricky thing for me.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions. Emily, did you have any more?
I don't think so, but I would like to thank you. Thank you, Mr. Eubanks, for being here with us. I know we've had several comments, and I agree that I can't wait to read the book. So we'll have to pre-order that. And thank you so much, Dr. Barnes, for introducing and running the questions. I want to remind everybody, I will post a survey link in the comments. This survey will be going around throughout the whole conference. And that's just so that we can, get some feedback. We'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned for the presentations coming up for the rest of the week. We have another one at 1 o'clock today. And again, thank y'all so much for being with us.